Good afternoon. Welcome to the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Michelle Hargrave, and I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director of this wonderful institution and of welcoming you all today. This summer, we've had the incredible honor of presenting the breathtaking exhibition, Clearly Indigenous, Native Visions Reimagined in Glass. This groundbreaking exhibition, which originated at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe, has captivated our audiences with its stunning display of artistry and cultural expression. We're deeply grateful to Dr. Letitia Chambers, who curated the exhibition alongside artist and museum consultant Kathy Short, and also authored the accompanying publication, which you can get online. And so it's a true privilege to welcome you today to the KIA, Dr. Chambers. We're equally honored to host two extraordinary glass artists whose work are featured prominently in our exhibition. Their artistry not only exemplifies mastery in their craft, but also brings to life the rich cultural narratives embedded within each piece. Please join me in welcoming Carol Lujan and Dan Friday to our event today. Bringing this exquisite exhibition to life at the KIA has been a collective effort, and there are many that we would like to thank for their invaluable contributions. First and foremost, again, our gratitude to Dr. Letitia Chambers for your visionary curating. And we also extend our thanks to the touring organization, International Arts and Artists, for making it possible for this exhibition to travel and to be seen by a broader audience. Within our own institution, I would like to acknowledge the dedication and hard work of our curatorial team, including Rehema Barber, who will be here this morning, and Catherine Ransbottom, whose expertise was instrumental, of course, in realizing the exhibition at the KIA. I would also like to commend our preparators, Mickey Williamson and Clara Peters, for their delicate and meticulous installation. For today's celebration of Clearly Indigenous, we're deeply appreciative, again, of course, of our guest speakers who've journeyed journey to be with us and share their insights. We also extend our gratitude to Art Kalamazoo for their partnership around today's live demonstrations and hands-on workshops. And a special thank you goes as well to the Alice L. Walton Foundation and the Arts Council of Greater Kalamazoo for their generous support of this program. And of course, I would also like to recognize Dr. Miriam Thomas, our Associate Curator of Adult Programs, for her exemplary planning and leadership around today's event. As well as all of our education team, Jennifer Cooley, who's in the booth, and Amy Hudson, who was welcoming everyone in today. And of course, my thanks as well to the talented group of KIA staff across every department, as well as to our volunteers, all of whom have given their time and energy to ensure the success of today's event. My thanks again to all of you for your contributions. And finally, my thanks as always to all of our members whose generous support of the KIA's mission enables us to present exhibitions and programs like this and to do everything that we do at the KIA. If you are not currently part of the KIA family, please, and would like to become so, please feel free to see me at some point during today, and I'd be happy to welcome you. So thank you again for coming, and with that, I would like to turn it over to Miriam Thomas.
Thank you, Michelle. And I just wanted to echo Michelle in thanking all of you who are here today, our wonderful guest speakers for making the journey to be with us today, and for the many, many folks who have been really instrumental in making this event happen. Before we move further, I would like to take a moment to share the KIA's Land and People Acknowledgement, developed in collaboration with the Michigan Transformation Collective. We honor and pay our respects to the land on which we stand and its traditional stewards, the Anishinaabe, the Council of Three Fires, which include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi, also known as the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi tribes. We also acknowledge the people of African descent who are stolen from their land and separated from their families through the enslavement Holocaust, and pay reverence and respect to them for building this country's infrastructure and economy with no compensation or reparations to date. So as you hear from our guest speakers today, you may decide that you want to learn more and make a day of it. If so, good news, there are still a few tickets available for the afternoon if you haven't already signed up for the afternoon events. Just visit our front desk to place your order, and those tickets are going to be on sale until 2:30 today or until we run out. So just be aware you can still grab a ticket. Those of you who are already planning to join us this afternoon, thank you. We're excited to move into that portion of the day as well. Please make sure to check the back of your programs for important notes about safety and parking. All right. I've also been asked to request that if you're sharing your experiences today on social media, please tag us at Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. Okay. All right, now it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Letitia Chambers. Dr. Chambers is a collector of Native American art who has been involved in issues affecting Indigenous Americans throughout her career, including serving as the CEO of Heard Museum in Phoenix, as a founding director and board chair of the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, and as a trustee of the Institute of American Indian Arts. Before focusing her career on the arts, Dr. Chambers was well known as a public policy expert at both the federal and state levels. She served as staff director of 2 U.S. Senate committees and as a U.S. ambassador to the UN General Assembly. She also headed the state system of higher education in New Mexico. Her private sector experience includes serving as CEO of a highly successful Washington, D.C.-based public policy consulting firm. Dr. Chambers maintains a consulting practice in Santa Fe and has curated several exhibitions at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and the Santa Fe Botanical Garden. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Letitia Chambers.
Thank you, Marion. It's such a pleasure to be here today. I'd never been to Kalamazoo before, and I came a day early so I could see your city and also to see the exhibit. You know, when it's in an exhibit, may have all the same pieces and all the same verbiage, but it looks different in every venue that it visits. And it's very interesting. I assume that many of you have seen the exhibit. Let me know if you have, and some of you haven't yet, but we'll be seeing it on tour. And I'm gonna make a few remarks here, and then we'll have a Q&A. So I'd like to ask you to hold your questions until I open the question and answer session. And then after that, we'll go to the tour and we'll look at different pieces, and I'll give you more information than is available on the signage about some of the pieces. And you can ask questions during that time as well. Now I'm gonna find my pointer here.
Right here, it was hiding.
Oh, there, okay. I also was pleased to learn that Kalamazoo is a bit of an art center, that you have a symphony, that you have theater companies, you have this wonderful museum and school connected. So I was very pleased to learn the interest in the arts here. So it's no surprise that the leadership here would have wanted to bring an exhibit of this caliber. Isn't it, for those who've seen it, isn't it an exciting body of work? It has a history, and it's the result, actually, of a history of 50 or 60 years, beginning 60 years ago, when the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe was created. And it was created as the vision of a man named Lloyd Keevaneu. And he was an artist working in Scottsdale. And he's the gentleman in the white tie in the middle. And standing next to him on the left is a man named Charles Lummi, who at that time was a very famous jeweler who sold his art in Paris and New York and around the country and around the world. And they had an art studio in Scottsdale together. And Lloyd also taught at the Indian school. He's Cherokee and Charles is Hopi. And I'm going into this history because it's important to how this body of work came to be. And Lloyd and Charles were very concerned that so many young Native artists didn't feel free to create art from their own sense of creativity. Because in colonial America, Native art was only valued if, in fact, it was exactly the art that Natives had been doing at the time of colonization. And so often a young Native artist who would want to branch out, which is, of course, the very definition of creativity, would be discouraged and would be encouraged to do only the art that had been done by their ancestors hundreds of years earlier. And Lloyd's vision was to free artists from that rigidity imposed by the colonial society so that young artists could express their cultural ways of knowing in a contemporary context. For those of you, I don't know if any of you are collectors or fans of Native art, but Fritz Scholder, who's one of the most famous Native artists, is in this photo. He's the gentleman standing there with his arm on a post, looking rather jaunty. And right over his shoulder is Alan Hauser, the famous sculptor. And when I was at the United Nations, a piece very similar to this was in the U.S. mission to the United Nations. And I used to walk by it every day and think how appropriate it was to have this peace offering at the United Nations mission. Alan became very famous, as did Fritz, for his paintings. And you have a Fritz Scholder in the building downstairs. And I show you these pieces because these were pieces from the 70s. This whole effort began in the 60s, and in the 60s and 70s, we really had this flowering of contemporary Native art. And at the same time that the Institute of American Indian Arts was being founded in Santa Fe, the studio glass arts movement began. It began in 1962. There's actually, most art movements begin over time, but in this case, there was a famous seminar at the Toledo Art Museum in Toledo, Ohio. And a man named Harvey Littleton was the leader of it. And young artists from around the country who were interested in glass were at that seminar. And after the seminar, several of the participants spread out around the country, going to be faculty in a number of art institutions. And one of those persons who attended the seminar was Dale Chihuly, who was then a young artist who had studied weaving in the beginning, and then he had moved into glass art, and he went to the Rhode Island School of Design. Now, these two movements were on parallel tracks through the 60s, and the Institute of American Indian Arts began as an arts high school, and it was moving to become a college, and they needed to have accredited courses. And so Lloyd New signed a contract with the Rhode Island School of Design, one of the leading art schools in the country, to send several faculty members to IAIA and to work with the faculty there to create accredited, college-accredited art courses. And luckily, one of the professors who came to IAIA to help create that curriculum was Dale Chihuly. And so in 1974, when Dale came to IAIA, it influenced Indian art going forward, and it also influenced Dale Chihuly's own art. Here you see Dale pouring molten glass out onto the desert floor because he wanted to see how the glass would move. And it's it was a seminal time in his life. He very broadly credits American Indian cultures for some of his inspiration. And likewise, many of the glass artists in Native country today have studied with Dale or been influenced by his work. Dale Chihuly's very first series was a series of cylinders, and he took the inspiration for these cylinders from the designs that he saw in Navajo weavings when he was in the Southwest. And there are 3 cylinders in the show. You'll see as we enter, they're right at the beginning, as we enter the exhibit in a few minutes. You'll see 2 of the cylinders are from the very beginning in the 70s, and one was done later. Here we see Dale back at the Rhode Island School of Design in 1975, working on this first series of cylinders. Then shortly after that, he began working making baskets, and he had been influenced by seeing the Salish baskets in museums. He grew up in Tacoma, and so the museums in the Pacific Northwest, many of them had collections of Salish baskets, and he loved their undulating shapes, their muted colors, and his very first basket series, and of course he's now world famous for his baskets, but his very first series were all in muted colors like this, and they were called the Tabak series of baskets. Of course, later he became known for his use of color and the wonderful colors that he is able to achieve in his work. But even you'll notice in these pieces that were made later, he continues to stack baskets together, which is how he had first seen the Salish baskets in the museums. I'm going to go back for a minute to the this Tabak series. As you'll notice, this one was made in 2008. And of course, the earlier ones were made mostly in the 70s. But this was such a popular series that there was a museum exhibition that just focused on that series. And he made this set of baskets for that series. Here we see Larry Avocada, who actually took a master's with Dale at the Rhode Island School of Design. Larry had graduated from IAIA and then studied with Dale. And then he came back and taught at IAIA. And here he is in the hot shop that Dale had built 3 years earlier. This is in 1977. And you'll see some of Larry's work in the exhibit. And he's living in Alaska now and still a working artist. As I was putting this information together, I, in fact, was doing it because I was a friend of Lloyd's, of Lloyd New, before he passed. He passed in 2003. 2002. And in 2001, he was at my house and he told me this story about Dale coming to IAIA. And he went into great detail. And then at the end of his telling this story, he turned to me and said, very pointedly, someone needs to write this story. Someone needs to write a book about this story. And I said, well, yes, somebody should, not intending for it to be me. But fast forward about 10 years, and I was the CEO of the Herd Museum in Phoenix. And we had a Preston Singletary exhibit. And I got to thinking about that story and Lloyd's desire to see the story in print. And so I started collecting information, and fortunately I was able to interview Dale Chihuly then, that was in 2011, and I began collecting the information just intending to write a book and maybe do an exhibit, but the book was primary. And as I was putting the book together and collecting images of pieces of art, I was struck by the fact that there was really a larger story to tell than just the story of the history and the story of the artists. And as I was writing the book, I organized it around the artists. Those of you who've seen the book, there's a whole section on the history, but then there's a section on each artist, and it tells their history and shows images of their work. But as I was going through it, I realized that the larger story was the intellectual content in these pieces of art. And that it was that intellectual content that really separated this body of work. And it's what makes it so stunning as a collection, is because it's not just things of beauty, but they are beautiful. It's not just things with beautiful color, and they are extremely colorful and luminous. But it is that cultural way of knowing, that expression of culture in the art, that makes this such an exciting exhibit. And so as I put together the exhibit, I started, instead of organizing around the artist, I organized it around the intellectual content. We have Dan Friday here with us today. I love his story about how he makes these baskets and the crisscross. And if he doesn't tell you in his presentation today or in the Q&A, ask him, because it's a really interesting story, and I'll save that story for him. I often, when I'm giving a tour, I'll tell the story, but it's his story to tell. Another artist who unfortunately passed away, but after the exhibit had already appeared in Santa Fe. And so he was able to see it, and he was just thrilled with the exhibit. It's Tony Hahola. And Tony enrolled at IAIA in 1975. And he then went out to Seattle and worked for Dale Chihuly for years. And if any of you are familiar with the Persian basket series that Dale Chihuly did, Tony was one of the main artists who was supporting Dale in the making of that Persian basket series. I particularly like the mottled color in this piece. Preston Singletary has been influential in working with Native artists. Dan and Preston and Raven Sky River, whose work you'll see in the exhibit, all work out of Seattle and are friends. But these baskets really represent the utilitarian nature of much Native art. And what struck me was that when a Northwest Coast artist a glass artist began making a vessel, they made them in the shape of baskets and to look like baskets, which is, of course, their traditional vessels were either baskets or boxes, because the wood was plentiful and other growing materials. But in the Southwest, the pottery was the type of vessels that people made. And of course, for those of you who are familiar with Native art or collectors of Native art, Pueblo pottery and the pottery of other tribes is highly collected because they're so beautiful. So these first thing that I really noticed was how, depending on what tribes and where the Native artists were from, depended on the shape of their baskets or their pots. The other thing that struck me as I was working with these young artists, both when I was at the Heard Museum and then when I had gone home to Santa Fe, was that this really is a collaborative art. And the artists working together. And sometimes you have an artist who blows glass, who then works with an artist who works in other media. Here we have a Preston Singletary piece that he did with Tammy Garcia. And this big pot, which you're going to see in just a little while, actually looks like a piece of clay pottery, of black pottery. But in fact, it's out of glass, and it's not until you kind of see the luminosity of the glass that you realize it's not a pot. Here we have Preston working with Tammy. In this case, Preston blew the vessel, and Tammy carved it and then sandblasted it. Here we have Preston working with Harlan Rieno, and you'll see this very piece that they're working on in the exhibit, and I'll point it out to you. Here we have Dan working with Lillian Pitt, and Dan and Preston have been very generous with their time in working with other Native artists. So in addition to doing their own work, they often collaborate with other Native artists. And in addition, they will work together, because glass is a difficult taskmaster and taskmaster. And sometimes you need several people working on a piece at once. And so these artists often collaborate with each other. Here we have the late Tony Hahola and Ira Lujan working at Prairie Dog Glass in Santa Fe. And here we have Carol Lujan working with Patrick Morrissey, who is one of the owners of Prairie Dog Glass, and Robert Spooner Marcus. And Spooner has also been one who has worked with other Native artists. And one of the things that I've really appreciated is how much these Native artists have influenced each other and how they love to work together. Tony Hahola said he thought that one reason that Native artists were drawn to glass art is because it is a community endeavor in a way, just as in their own tribal societies they work communally often. Other expressions of collaboration, Dan told me once that he saw working in glass like being in a band, and that there's a rhythm to it, and that everybody gets into that rhythm to work together. Preston mentioned that he saw it as choreography, with everyone moving together in concert. So these collaborations are very important to this body of work. And the artists have enjoyed working with each other. And when I interviewed every artist for the book and then worked with them to choose images for the book, and then to choose the art pieces for the exhibit. And as I was working with each artist and talking with them, one thing that struck me is how they would mention that when they met another Native artist, that it gave them courage and confidence in working in art. For instance, Brian Barber, who's a Pawnee, most of these artists are either from the Pacific Northwest, due to the Pilchuck School being there and Chihuli's studio being there, or from the Southwest due to the influence of IAIA and the glass studio there. But Brian Barber was a young Pawnee from Oklahoma who had studied at Wisconsin and was not connected to all these artists. And he saw a little blurb about a course that was going to be at the Pilchuck School that Preston was doing, and they were going to build a totem pole to honor the founders of Pilchuck, which was Dale Chihuly and two philanthropists. And so Brian went out and he said it just opened his eyes to the fact that there were other Native artists, and he felt more confident in being a glass artist when he saw other Native artists. Ransom Loma Tawama, who's Hopi, expressed the same thing, that when he met Preston and Dan and others and Tony Hahola, that he felt like he could really begin working in glass. So the importance of community is really a key here. As I was organizing the exhibit, and we're not going to dwell too long on these pieces because many of them we're going to see. And I will say that in the book, there are images that are not in the exhibit. And in the exhibit, there are objects that are not photographed in the book. The two really stand alone. The book was written not as a catalog of the exhibit, but to stand on its own as a book about the art and the artists. But one of the things that struck me was how many of the pieces dealt with creatures of the sea or the land or the sky. And Raven Sky River has done a number of sea creatures. He grew up on an island in the Puget Sound area, and so it's not surprising that he focused on sea creatures. And you'll see this beautiful piece in the exhibit. The piece just before it is actually not in the exhibit, but a gray version of this whale is. This piece is by Marvin Oliver. Marvin taught at Washington State University in Seattle. And here he fused pieces of glass together and then floated them in a metal frame. And this piece is in the Children's Hospital in Seattle. Marvin has since left us as well, or walked on, as one often hears in the Native community. Here's a wonderful piece of dance called Forge Your Bear Totem. This was actually collected by Steve and Roddy Harris in Santa Fe. And Steve used to be an executive with General Motors. And when I told him that the exhibit was going to be in Kalamazoo, he said that he was very familiar with the museum here and that they used to come over from Detroit for openings. He and his wife's an artist, and so they were quite complimentary of this institution. Here's a piece by Spooner Marcus of turtles. And I put this piece in with the animals, even though it's a vessel, because I love these turtles. Here is a raven with a rattle by Preston. Adrian Wall is a young sculptor. He works in clay and stone and glass, and he often does multimedia pieces. And you'll see several of Adrian's works when we're in the exhibit. Here, this is, he called this the Milky Way. Preston collaborated with an Aboriginal artist on this. Several Aboriginal artists came to Seattle. They worked with Preston and some with Dan at seminars. And this artist, Marawili, you really see that this is like a bark painting. So he too, this Indigenous Aboriginal Australian, when he began working in glass, he too showed the type of technique and subject matter that he would use in a bark painting, which was the traditional native art in Australia. As I've said, this body of art is really distinguished by its intellectual content, and I think that's particularly visible in the pieces in the exhibit that represent ancestors' voices. Here's a piece by Preston and Marcus Ammerman called Kill Bear, and there were several pots that were found in the digs at Cahokia in Ohio, and this is a rendition in glass. Marcus's Choctaw, which are the Mounds cultures, and so this piece by Lillian Pitt. There is a pictograph that's high on a mountain in the Columbia River Gorge, where Lillian is from, and this is her version in glass, and she calls it She Who Watches, because her community was watched over by this pictograph high on the mountain. Here we have a piece. Actually, this is mislabeled. It's supposed to be Dan Friday and Lillian Pitt. Dan blew the vessel, and then Lillian did the stencils for the design, and Dan and Lillian together rolled the pot over the stencils to create the design of the pot. Sorry, Dan. I'll be sure I get that corrected. But as I said, it's really wonderful the way these artists have worked together. Here we have Preston Singletary working with Joe David, and you'll see this piece. One of the things I love about this is you see this beautiful head that the mask that Joe David did that's clearly Nuchal Nulf, which is his culture in Canada, his First Nations. But the bust, the clothing could be almost from any culture. It's sort of a classical look. And one of the things you see here are borrowings. We have to be wary that there's not cultural appropriation, that one culture doesn't basically take from another in a way that is appropriating their work in a way that's not appropriate. But in fact, cultures borrow from each other. And so I kind of liked the fact that they put that this piece represented both the New Chalmnoth and a more classical culture. The other section that I particularly love is the Bridging Two Worlds. And Preston Singletary and Harlan Rieno did this piece. You saw them working on the piece in the photograph, and you'll see this piece in the exhibit. And Harlan lives on Cochiti Pueblo, though he was born next door at Santo Domingo, now Tewa Pueblo. And there's a tradition of making figures at Cochiti. And this Preston and Harlan making this figure in the style of the standing Cochiti figures was, I thought, quite brave to try to create a standing piece like this. The balance is incredible. Here's a piece by Ransom Lomatawama. It's called Corn Maiden. Ransom, too, has taught. Many of the people that we're the artists that are in the exhibit have taught. Carol was a professor at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona. And I love Carol's story. I'll let her tell it, and I won't try to steal her thunder. But I love it when people have one career. She was a well-known professor, and she did art on the side as a hobby. And when she retired, she turned to doing her art full time. And I love it when people reinvent themselves in retirement. I'm sure some of you have found new interests after you've retired, and maybe even new careers. Here we have a piece by Angela Babby, and we're going to see 3 pieces of hers. And I'm going to wait to talk about the content of the pieces when we're in the exhibit. But I want to tell you about her technique because it's so unusual. For her background, she takes different colors of glass sheet and puts them together and creates her background. And then she takes a powdered glass and liquefies it. And then she paints on her background with that liquefied glass as if it's oil. And she creates the paintings. And then she has to leave it to dry, and it's extraordinarily fragile. You can imagine it's basically just, and so then she puts it in the kiln to fire and creates these pieces. So I love her technique, which she developed herself, and I don't know of anybody else that's in glass art that's doing this. So I love the fact that she has created this incredible technique. But when we see her works, I want to focus on the content of them because that too is really special. Here, this one is called Melt: Prayers for the People and the Planet. And then we'll see this work by Joe Feddersen. This photograph does not do it justice, but fortunately you'll get to see it in person. And Joe creates these pieces by creating charms in glass. And some are ancient symbols, and others are very modern. You'll see a bicycle You'll see other parts of more modern life, but then you'll see pieces that are made to resemble pictographs or petroglyphs. This piece is by Preston and Gunebi Ganenbar. Ganenbar is also from Australia, an Aboriginal artist. And one of the things that really struck me as I was going through all of the pieces is here we have Ganenbar, who literally is from the southwest coast of Australia. If he looks out, there's nothing between him and Antarctica. So he's at one end of the world. And here we have Joe Feddersen, who is from the northwest coast at the opposite end of the world. And both of them did a series, unknown to each other, of looking at how modern life has affected landscapes and how landscapes change. And both of them have carried on this particular interest. Here, Joe Feddersen did a series. It had, you see this larger piece is like highway markings. Another one is of tire tracks. He did a piece that's actually at the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., that was a QR code piece. And so it's looking at the difference in the way landscapes were. And there's another piece that Joe did that's more of a dreamscape, as landscapes might have been in the past, and then juxtaposing it with modern landscapes. So I wanted to cover just these few things. We'll take questions now. The book is available in your library. It has been available in your shop, but I think I heard that it was sold out. Perhaps they'll be getting it again, but you can also order it from any bookseller or through Amazon. And I can feel comfortable flacking the book, so to speak, because I gave all my royalties to the Museum of Indian Art and Culture in Santa Fe. So I wanted to see that the museum would be able to continue to do some of these wonderful exhibits that they have shown. So the exhibit is now traveling. This is one of the traveling sites. It'll be going, it's scheduled on this tour for 8 venues. I believe this is the 3rd. It'll go to the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, which is a wonderful museum. The Mingy Museum, a major museum in San Diego. It's going to New York City, to the Museum of the American Indian there. One of the things that really thrills me about this tour is that most of the venues on the tour are art museums. And one thing that Native artists have often had to fight was that people wanted to put their work in anthropological museums instead of putting these fine art pieces in art museums. So I've been very thrilled that there are so many art museums that are showing these incredible works. When it's in New York City, though, it'll be at the Museum of the American Indian, and I'm very excited that it's going to New York. So I will take your questions now, and then we'll head down. How much time do we have for questions before we head to the exhibit?
Let's say about 15 minutes.
Okay, yes.
I have 2 questions. One is about the concept of appropriation. I'm wondering if when Indigenous peoples of various tribes or bands, I don't know what I'm supposed to call them, borrow from each other, is there more leeway than if white people steal their art for their own purposes. My other question is way more practical. I'm very curious about the technique. I forgot the artist's name, but the little Pueblo girl. I don't know what glass sheeting is. And I also don't know, when you say paint, I would think that you couldn't use like a paintbrush because the bristles would get, so I don't understand how she would, what tools she would use.
Okay, well, it's Angela Babby who did the piece. That's actually an Inuit girl, and she's walking on the tundra that's melting. And so the glass, you can buy glass that is literally in sheets. And so she uses those in different colors and puts them together to create that background. And Carol may be able, when she's talking, to shed a little bit more light, because Carol, you also use the glass sheets at times. And so you might, Carol might deal with that. As far as appropriation, it's a fine line as to when it's cultural appropriation and when it's not. But tribes have a history of collaborating and working together. And so if someone made a Hopi pot and they were not Hopi, and they clearly used the Hopi technique and the Hopi design, that might be considered cultural appropriation. But if natives borrow from each other, I think it's generally not viewed as cultural appropriation when they're working together. But let's say, for instance, if Dale Chihuly had seen a Navajo rug, and he had then not just been inspired by the beauty of the weaving, but he had then taken a Navajo design and had made it explicitly and called it Navajo or Dine, which is the appropriate name of the tribe, that would have been cultural appropriation. What he did was actually more inspiration. And so one has to be careful. And in fact, I was asked by Chihuly Studio to write a little section, and Chihuly has a wonderful museum at the bottom of the Space Needle in Seattle, and they actually asked me to write a little section on cultural appropriation to go in a section of the museum that had some of the tobacco baskets and cylinders. So it's good to be wary and knowledgeable about cultural appropriation. Other questions? I kind of covered every question that would come to mind, but more will come to mind when you see these beautiful pieces. Okay, well then we might as well go right on down and